About 11 years ago, the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed. A few weeks ago, we did an Austin Faith Dialogue program on the churches and disability. Today, we continue our conversation about the churches and accessibility, and we'll see some ways to make our churches more accessible. Stay with us for today's Austin Faith Dialogue.
Austin Faith Dialogue, at the crossroads of religion and life, a series highlighting the cultural and social interactions between the worshiping and religious communities in and around the capital city. Austin Faith Dialogue is brought to you by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KXAN. Join us now in Austin Faith Dialogue.
Thank you for joining us on Austin Faith Dialogue today. I'm Sandy Wilder, your host, and today we talk again about accessible churches. We're doing the show a little bit differently because my guest, Kelly Caudell, has a hearing difficulty, so I will be speaking much more slowly so Kelly can understand. Kelly, welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. Welcome to Austin Faith Dialogue. Thank you for coming. And we have questions prepared. I will simply read the first question and you can respond. The first question for you is to tell us what is the ADA and how does the Americans with Disabilities Act affect churches?
Well, the ADA stands for the American Disability Act that was passed in 1990 at the national level, and the former Bush president signed that legislation. And this is regarded pretty much as a civil rights act for people with disabilities. It includes also requirements of accessibility for public buildings, accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, transportation, libraries, government buildings, and so forth. Generally, however, the American Disability Act does not apply to churches or religious institutions. The National Council of Churches specifically came to the legislators and asked that the churches be exempt from this legislation. And I think possibly this was due primarily to the fear of high costs to meet the accommodations required and government interference with church matters. However, when federal money is used in a church premise, such as a daycare center, and subcontracted, and that center is receiving federal funds, then that church has to make those accommodations on their facilities.
So there is a requirement of accessibility when federal money is involved.
Right, pretty much. And I think it's fair to say that there's some other areas of concern, such as when a church has X number of employees, they are required to follow the Non-Discrimination Acts related to employment.
So
now, churches must also obey the building codes and the zoning laws at the local level. But the building codes now follow the guidelines of ADA. So indirectly, they're in compliance with the ADA. Now, this applies only to new buildings and new renovations, not to old buildings. One of the beautiful results of the ADA, however, has been that when the regulations were written, the standards were established. And with those standards, the churches were able to look at what is needed and what the standards were so that they could voluntarily comply with the ADA Accommodations Act.
So what gets in the way why do churches not comply with ADA? What are the problems in complying with ADA?
I think eventually it may boil down to the fact that we're looking at a separation of church and state. But the AADA is basically a government product. And the scriptures say, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. There are some reasons that churches are not as accessible as they would like to be. Much, however, to the credit of many of our church congregations, they have made much progress. Now we see, just like we see in public buildings, we see ramps, curb cuts, we see accommodative restrooms, wider doors, we see interpreters in the churches, we see captioning. We see a lot of these accommodations that are required in many public entities. But a great area of concern as to why the churches aren't more involved, one is, I believe, is that the seminaries and schools that train the pastors and educational leaders and other leadership people in the church are not exposed adequately to the needs and the problems of people with disabilities. And many of our seminaries train for other particular groups of people, such as young people. We have youth directors. We have seniors, so we have people who work with seniors. We have people who work with singles. We have music ministries. We have recreational ministries. So I think that the seminaries need to take note of this and develop curriculum that would help the pastors during their seminary training, as well as provide some post-seminary training in this area of disability ministry.
So one problem is leadership. What is another problem with churches not complying with ADA?
Well, I think a big issue is the cost, the money. And it's not an excuse, I think it's a reality. For example, a church, if the church was forced, for example, to put in an elevator in their building which had second stories, it would almost be prohibitive. And the renovation of restrooms can be extremely expensive. And churches that are operating on a limited budget without any tax money coming in can be very difficult. And we need to recognize that probably the mega churches, which is only about 10% of all the churches in our country, the mega churches, they have sufficient funds to do pretty much what needs to be done. But the smaller churches, which is the national average, probably runs somewhere between 150 and 200 members. And these churches do not have that kind of funding to provide those accommodations. Some possibility might be that mega churches could, in fact, help some of the smaller churches make these accommodations.
Now, when we talk about the Austin area, about how many disabled people are we talking about?
Well, when you think about the Austin area, we're talking about a population of 19.5 or 20% of the population has a disability. And these statistics were given to me about 3 years ago from the Texas Department of Human Services. Our population has grown, so I think it's reasonable to say it's 20%. And there are some reasons for this. One is we have 3 state schools here for handicapped individuals. State school for the deaf, state school for the blind, and state school for the mentally retarded. And these people bring their children to these schools, and they move here to Austin. And of course, they set roots here, and they stay here. Another reason is that we do have a lot of services here that help handicapped people. The central offices are here, like the Texas Rehabilitation Commission, the Texas Commission for the Blind, the Texas Commission for the Deaf are here. And we have many nonprofits that subcontract with these larger agencies to provide services in the community. So we actually are having people move from out of state here to Austin. Austin, as far as I can see, this is probably about the third largest area of the disabled population as it relates to deaf people. We think there's up to 10,000 deaf people living right here in Austin now.
And what is the average deaf population, the average disabled population in an area? It's not as high as 20%.
The average is about 10%. But like I mentioned, we have these 3 state schools here, all in one city. So we have a higher percentage of the population.
So do you think that we have a higher percentage and therefore we provide better services for the disabled?
I think that's legitimate to say, but I am not in a position to say how the churches stack up to those accommodations.
Go on.
Well, I think that when we think about why the churches are not providing the accommodation, I think another area is that there is a level of fear within the congregation's membership and possibly the leadership. That is fear of the unknown, the lack of knowledge about, well, how do you work with these people? There is an unconscious thinking that, do these people have diseases that are contagious? I often tell people I'm deaf, and I tell them, but don't worry, it's not contagious. People are worried about medical problems that may happen in church if they come. They may be concerned about the able-bodied people having a fear of not coming if these people come.
Fear can be a powerful motivator. And we need to take a break now and come back. So I will ask you more questions in just a minute. Thank you for joining us on the first half of Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll look forward to seeing you again in just a minute. Thank you for joining us on Austin Faith Dialogue today. We're talking about accessible churches with a person who used to be on the staff of the Texas Rehabilitation Commission and now is the coordinator of the Austin Faith and Disability Group. Our guest is Kelly Caudell. Thank you for coming, Kelly. Now, we were talking about reasons why churches do not comply with the ADA, and you have one more point?
Well, I think there is an area of concern about, and this is coming from our research and from the churches themselves and really from service providers. The handicapped population or the disabled population is not going to the churches. They are not waving a red flag and saying, let us in, like they have done with other public entities when the ADA was passed. They're not inclined to even come to the church as a member and make a complaint, or hopefully it would be regarded as a recommendation. But when one person makes an issue of something, it is a complaint from the church's viewpoint. If it's done from a group, it can be called a recommendation. I think that overall, one of the biggest issues that I run into, of course, is that cost factor. I talked with a pastor here in Austin. He said, well, it would cost us $500,000 to do this. And our church is old and our membership is going down, and we just could not afford it. But I grew up in an area where people were saying and taught me, where there's a will, there's a way. And I like to remind you that God is not broke.
Thank you. Also, our faith causes us to reach out to everybody. So if a church is ready to reach out to people with disabilities, what resources are available?
Well, I think there is a host of resources. One, of course, is that the churches can contact their own denominational leadership. Many of the denominations do have accessibility and disability ministry programs. I think probably the Catholic and Lutheran, Methodists and Baptists take a leadership role in these areas. Another, of course, is for senior citizens to check out the AARP. They have some concern about the religious opportunities that the senior citizens in the country have. Another might be to check the Christian Council on Persons with Disabilities. This is an organization composed of a coalition of disability service providers across the nation. They have wonderful information about disability ministries for the church and for their own membership.
Kelly, where is the coalition? Where is their headquarters?
The coalition is located, I think it's in Minnesota. I'm not really sure about that, but we meet in a different city every year. Last year it was in California. Next year it's going to be in Florida. Usually have members from all over the country to come together and share information about how they are developing their own disability ministries. Another very attractive resource is Joni and Friends. And you might have read about Joni, who had a diving accident. And she has a worldwide program of disability ministry. And one of their field offices right here in Texas, in Austin. And they have 3 big areas of ministry. One is they gather wheelchairs and they renovate them. Then they distribute them to third world countries. Another area that they provide is retreats for disabled people and their families. And I've been to some of these retreats and they are excellent. They're usually a week long. Another area that they have is church disability training. They provide resource materials and help to churches to work in this area of disability ministry. In fact, Joni is the person who developed and initiated the Christian Council on persons with disabilities. Another is the National Organization on Disability in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
This organization has a religion disability division, very active. They promote that all may worship conferences all over the country. We've had a few here in Texas. We've been trying to get one established here in Austin. And they have some fantastic materials as to what the churches can do and what suggestions that they make. They give a lot of really very practical information as to what the churches can do. Then there are specialized services in the country like Bethesda, which serves the developmentally disabled. They have offices all across the country.
Is that Bethesda Hospital?
No, that's in Minnesota. It's a huge campus, and they have offices around the country. They have consultants, and they work with service providers to help the developmentally disabled and those who are mentally retarded. But many of their constituency are multiple handicap.
Okay.
Multiple handicap. There's a group out in Iowa called Deaf Missions, and they develop materials that are focused and specific to deaf people. We have advocates in the community like ARC here in Austin. They have tried to work with us to develop That All May Worship conference, and they're doing an informal survey because their biggest need from their clients is that the parents are coming and say, where are the churches that my child can go to and feel good or have a good friend there, or they have the right accommodations? I think that one of the best resources that I've run into is the Boggs Center, which is a university-affiliated program in New Jersey. They print a journal as well as a newsletter, and they have tremendous resources that are very inexpensive for churches to find out where are all the resources. You can find a lot of this information, of course, if you're adapt to using the web, because all of these people have their own web pages.
And now, tell us a little bit about the group that you work with, Austin Faith and Disability. What does it do?
Well, the Austin Faith and Disability group is really an initiative that was started with the Texas Coalition of People with Disabilities. I've been the coordinator since we initiated this, and we have met with a number of other organizations seeking to develop a partnership in the community. It's an ongoing process and probably ripe to the point where we can possibly get some funding, because we have developed some strategic plan. And this plan basically says that we need to have a survey of the disabled population, and a survey of the churches, and a survey of the advocates.
We have never had a survey in Austin?
Never. We've not had that opportunity because that takes funding. I've gone to UT, and we had almost an open window there, but it didn't happen. I think if we were able to do that, we could develop a database that would show us what the needs are in those different groups. And then we could establish materials and assistance, consultation, and funding, hopefully, to the churches to help them meet those needs.
Are there any churches in Austin that are meeting the needs of disabled people?
I think there are, but they're hiding almost, because it's very difficult, I don't know why, for churches to advertise that they are disability friendly. The Statesman, for example, features churches. I have yet to see one say, we are disabled friendly. We invite disabled people to come to our church because we have the accommodations. And no church can provide all the needs. But even the churches that provide sign language interpreters, they don't mention it.
And yet the need is there. And so if churches would advertise what they offer, you could say, yes, disabled people would come.
That's right. Up to a point, at least that would be a big help, because then the service providers, individuals could refer their clients to churches that are accommodated. Now, there are 2 mega churches here in town that signed off on the National Organization on Disabilities campaign for accessibility. Their goal was to sign up 2,000 churches last year, and they were able to meet that goal. 2 churches, First Methodist Church and Bannockburn Baptist Church here in Austin, signed off on that campaign, saying that they make a commitment to develop their accessibility in their particular church, their premises, and their membership.
Now, if a church wants to get involved and wants to provide services for disabled people, should they contact you?
If they do through the email, I'd be happy to respond to them. If they're interested in working with us, I'd be happy to talk with them about what the needs are and how we might go about it.
What would you ultimately want the religious community in Austin to do for disabled people? What is your dream?
Well, the scriptures say that the church is a house of worship for all. And it should not only be open to all, but it should be open enough that it will be attractive enough for the disabled population to go. I've seen some statistics that are almost horrifying. 92% of the disabled population not affiliated with any church.
There is a great need and a great possibility, isn't there? Kelly, thank you. We will continue our conversation another time. And thank you for joining us this week on Austin Faith Dialogue. We'll see you here again next week.